Upon Studio Mappa's announcement that they would be adapting Chainsaw Man into an anime, the manga's author, Fujimoto Tatsuki, expressed his enthusiasm with the statement, "Wait, the studio that did Dorohedoro and Jujutsu Kaisen is doing the Dorohedoro and Jujutsu Kaisen knockoff Chainsaw Man? What else is there to say? I can't wait to work with them." After an 18-year run, Dorohedoro ended in 2018, the same year Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen would begin their comparatively popular publications, and coincidentally or not, the three of them inhabit a Venn diagram of similarities, such as an agency using magic powers to fight the physical manifestations of humanity's fears, an ensemble cast of socially inept assholes centered around the goofy antics of a boy and girl, the main protagonist containing another character who occasionally turns them into a killing machine, and the world featuring more violence and darkness than might be expected. They grow only further apart over time, and Chainsaw Man certainly isn't a knockoff of either of them, but of the three, Chainsaw and Doro share the most interesting points of comparison. Sorry Jujutsu Kaisen, but you're the generic one of the group. Fujimoto is open about his influences, including his particular admiration for foreign cinema, but rather than outright copy and pasting, he understands ideas well enough to make them just one of many inspirations of ideas more distinctly his. And regarding his use of humour and absurdism, he says, "I'm not trying to abruptly change the tone of my story or break the rhythm by injecting humour. My change of tone comes first and foremost through the intervention of a disruptive character. It allows me to destabilise the point of view that the reader initially has on my story. My reference in the matter is the Korean film The Wailing, in which the viewer ends up not knowing by which end he should follow the scenario because of how much the director throws red herrings and cover tracks. I tried to attain the same effect in Fire Punch, but in Chainsaw Man I think I'll refrain myself, because it could harm the global understanding of the manga." Such self-awareness has contributed to Fujimoto's growing reputation as somewhat of a manga savant, and in comparison to the almost equally anonymous author of Dorohedoro, which I can see how Fujimoto might have realised he was following partially in the footsteps of, his understanding has resulted in a story more precise with its structure and meaning. The title, Dorohedoro, is a Japanese wordplay that can be summarised as mud sludge, referring to the lake of sludge around which the human world known as Whole is built, the grimy violence that permeates the unpleasant worlds of the humans, sorcerers and devils, the chaotically muddy structure of the narrative, and the misshapen, scratchy and scribbly art style Hayashida draws with impressively consistent density alongside the occasional acidic colour page with zero regard for realism and the textured volume covers that can't even be accurately printed. Whether or not Hayashida is as much of a punk rock rule breaker as her manga suggests, she certainly loves to play around with unconventional materials and techniques, stating in a 2006 interview with MHZ magazine, "I'm actually the kind of person who would love to just ink a page right after I'm finished doing the sketches for it. I hate working at that assembly line pace." No doubt unique and complementary of the world and story, the monotony of the ceaselessness of its dense messiness is nonetheless proportional to however long its novelty takes to wear off. Where Chainsaw's art finds itself closest to Doro is during chaotic action sequences, wherein the messiness complements the volatility of said chaos rather than doubling down on what becomes a somewhat oppressive compositional indistinguishability you quickly understand to be typical of Doro. Fujimoto also plays around with vibrant, unrealistic colours, but instead of turning every stylistic choice up to 11, he employs a greater variety of styles to suit different circumstances. From minimalistic sketchiness that focuses on the expressive faces characters often pull to humorous effect, to surprisingly detailed wide angles. His goal ultimately being to use paneling to replicate live-action film cinematography and editing, and the result taking full advantage of the format to restrain his idiosyncrasies in ways that create a cohesively compelling, easily readable experience. When adapting a manga that so effectively uses the limited frames of its medium like this, it's unavoidable certain visual characteristics can't be accurately replicated in anime, where the viewer has less initiative in the rhythm of their consumption. But the first season of Chainsaw's anime is host to a whole nother controversy concerning the director's rejection of typical anime stylistic tropes in favour of something closer to live action. People are right to perceive the removal of various anime-isms, which the director explicitly expresses expressed interest in challenging, and the Blu-ray sales may have consequently suffered in Japan, where the anime style is most popular, but as far as I've seen, Western audiences have for the most part positively received this alternatively accessible vision, and though it perhaps strayed too far into realism in a couple of places, no reasonable fan should denounce the first season as a poor or even inaccurate representation of the manga. MAPPA already took a big risk fully committing to self-financing all of Chainsaw Man with the hopes it would pay off more and help the studio become more self-sustainable than if they took the usual approach of being contracted by other companies, and then they handed it over to someone for whom it was their directorial debut. Given this commitment and the manga's popularity, the production is noticeably higher quality than the adaptation of Doro's first season that released 3 years earlier, with more detailed movement and lighting, better blended 3D animation, and doubling the amount of unique ending sequences and songs in the same number of episodes, helping represent additional colourful interpretations of the manga more in line with the vibrant colour pages I'd personally find overwhelming to witness over a whole season, and highlight the plot beats and characters of their respective episodes, coming along with its own challenges, putting off those who have been burned by previous lazy implementations of 3D animation. It allows them to fill in the gaps their TV schedule doesn't give them the time to deliver with the understandably preferred 2D, such as the intricacies of Denji's chainsaw form or dynamic camera movements around an environment. Without the crutch of the anime-isms studios can usually cut animation corners with, the production efficiency these 3D sequences were sacrificed to provide is all the more important to visually express the characters' personalities. Whether you like the anime style or not, you can't deny it's a far more interesting visual feast than all of the generic stuff that still makes up the vast majority of the industry. Chainsaw and its themes mix comedy with seriousness in ways that can be complemented by something more realistic than Doro, the adaptation for which took the opposite approach of making the grimy darkness of the manga's art more vibrant and cartoony, a style certainly stemming from an inability to animate such messy detail. However, the direction around the stiff jankiness of the 3D character models, and in fact the stiff jankiness itself, contributes to a lighter comedic tone that is, in my opinion, well suited to the story and characters, and makes for a much needed easy watching experience. This is because, contrary to Chainsaw, Doro very much maintains its frivolous absurdity throughout the increasingly deliberately convoluted genre hodgepodge of its narrative, Hayashida pretty much just writing whatever bizarre circumstances her mind can think up, whilst perhaps never quite knowing when it might end, resulting in a perpetually chaotic world of zany characters and magical mysteries she doesn't stitch up into something as satisfyingly coherent as Chainsaw has thus far been able to on its way towards the same amount of chapters. Part of the appeal of Doro may be that it's an ever-enlarging, chaotic brawl of plot convergences, but by the time I finished the manga, the cohesion of the first season and its corresponding chapters ended up being the most compelling arc of the series, featuring a good balance of goofy tangents around a straightforward mystery as we learn about the bizarre fantasies of the world and only have to juggle a manageable amount of distinctly different characters. When the end of the manga was in sight, Hayashida resisted the temptation to conclude it hastily and, upon re-evaluating everything up to then, managed to keep it going for several more volumes. Whilst the artistic integrity to keep working on one thing for so long is commendable, and I can't exactly see how she might have brought it to a hasty conclusion, I do think the manga as a whole would have benefited from some of the purposeful restraint Fujimoto exercises, managing to walk a fine line between out-of-control creativity and succinct introspection of what exactly he wants to explore and get out of his stories. When asked about his previous manga, Fire Punch, which ran for only 83 chapters, Fujimoto says, "I knew from the get-go that I didn't want to make it too long. The same goes for Chainsaw Man. Actually, every time I make a short story, I want to develop it beyond what was planned. In contrast, when I start a longer series, I'd rather see the end of it pretty quickly. Haha. More seriously, I don't see the appeal in squeezing the lemon until it's dry if the scenario doesn't ask for it, and I would feel queasy if I were embarked in a manga unacceptably long. You are a prisoner of a creation and you cannot do anything else. I can't do that." Like its messy artwork, and regardless of how self-aware it is, the novelty of these chaotic shambles wears off and becomes a hindrance to Doro developing much thematic or emotional depth. As the series goes on, and the cast expands, and their personalities change for the worse for various magic reasons, and how long can be devoted to their subplots gets reduced, and the never quite explained mysteries we cut away from before getting concrete answers keep pushing the boundaries of the magical mechanics, and at the end of it all, the only character development the members of each faction have gone through is that they don't hate each other enough to incite violence on sight anymore, it gets to be a bit grating. Doro is a collection of absurd ideas that bend to conveniently push the plot forward, whereas Chainsaw, despite having magic with similarly limitless potential, steadily delivers brief doses of absurdity during sequences of genuine black comedy in service of the story's underlying drama. Not merely a cacophony of personalities accidentally surviving a crude, surrealist Scooby-Doo chase, but multifaceted people platforming themes through their development. Doro's magic adds layers of complexity through deeply woven unpredictability the manga feels like it exists to present, and as such, the reader must engage with the magic head-on to understand the full scope of the narrative. But Chainsaw goes down an accessible route by which the simple rules of the magic add colour to the prioritized character arcs and themes. Of course, on a surface level, Chainsaw is already unusually violent and sexual for shonen, and Fujimoto is aware that had he tried to publish it in the early 2000s, like Doro, he would not have been able to reap the greater profits of the popular Shonen Jump magazine, saying, "I am aware that what I am presenting doesn't match exactly with the specifications of Shonen Jump, and ultimately, more than pressure, I feel the need to apologize for being here. I think that before the 2000s, my project would have had very little chance to pass. To be honest, I still wonder why they are letting me do such a thing." In the same interview, Fujimoto's editor says, "Maybe we are in a time which seeks change. In the 80s, there were productions which showed explicit scenes, especially sexual scenes, and they didn't put much of a problem because that is what the readers expected and wanted. With Chainsaw Man, we are aware to be pushing Jump's editorial line to its very limits." Doro and Chainsaw are two of the most intense examples I've seen of this blurring line between shonen and seinen, concerning not just what appeals to each demographic, but what is even considered suitable to market to them. Doro's whimsical violence vaguely features themes of enduring friendship, finding common ground between enemies, accepting oneself, and the oppression of the ungifted in an anarchistic society, but underutilizes and treats them with humor such that, in today's industry, Doro would be more at home in shonen magazines. In comparison to Doro and many of its shonen contemporaries, Chainsaw delves into the profoundly humanistic desires and struggles of its characters, addressing such dilemmas as the public's opinions on weapons of mass destruction, what it means to live a good life, and the inevitable trauma of living in such a macabre world, all the whilst somewhat satirically poking fun at and subverting many of the superhero tropes that make up much of the shonen manga and anime and Western media it's sharing a fanbase with. If Chainsaw Man is pushing superficial boundaries with the eccentricities of Fujimoto's violence and humour, a little digging reveals it really deserves to stand out because of the unusually sharp resonance of its themes, keeping the crazy gags and shocks and twists neatly laid out so it can all be captured in a light more meaningful than how anything is presented in the undiluted, chaotic creativity of Dorohedoro.